At 5:15 a.m., the Russian offensive didn't stall. It ended. Not after a day of fighting, not after a breakthrough, not after a heroic last stand. It ended in the time it takes to blink, when 60 tons of steel and desperation snapped, pitched forward, and buried itself in freezing mud like a ship going down in slow motion. Russia had brought a $5 million T-80 to a 70-foot creek and tried to turn it into a bridge. A Frankenstein machine, welded, bolted, caged, and shoved into a blizzard, built for one purpose: force a crossing near Pokrovsk and open the door for an armored column waiting behind it. Moscow needed this to work, not because it looked good on a map, but because logistics don't care about speeches, headlines, or handshakes. Without a crossing, heavy equipment doesn't move. Without movement, offensives die. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't a story about one tank. It was a story about momentum, about supply lines, about a single bottleneck so ugly, so muddy, so narrow, that an entire plan could live or die right there on that riverbank. The Kremlin believed the storm would hide them. Snow whipping sideways, visibility collapsing, wind screaming across the steppe. They thought Ukrainian drones would be grounded, blind, useless. They thought electronic warfare would finish the job, jam the skies, cut the feeds, swat the attackers down like insects, and roll that improvised bridge into place while nobody could see. But Ukraine had been watching for days, not with hope, with math. They didn't need a clear sunrise to spot a tank engine glowing against cold ground. They didn't need luck to find a bridge layer crawling toward the only viable crossing for miles. They just needed patience, and a plan that didn't rely on radio waves when Russia's jammers came online. Because this operation wasn't designed to win early. It was designed to let Russia commit, to let them push the bridge out farther and farther until the machine was under maximum stress, until every kilogram of forward weight turned that breakthrough into a trap. And when the moment arrived, the strike wasn't loud. It was precise. It didn't waste time chewing through armor. It went for the single point that held everything together. The hinge, the joint, the one part that, once it failed, meant physics would do the killing for free. In less than 5 seconds, a crossing became a grave, and the convoy behind it didn't just lose a bridge, it lost time, it lost mobility, it lost the option to keep pretending this offensive was still alive. Russia's problem wasn't courage, it was geography. The river near Pokrovsk didn't look impressive. On satellite images, it was a thin, crooked line cutting through farmland and frozen mud, barely 70 feet wide, something a civilian truck could almost cross in summer. But in winter, with vertical banks and saturated ground, it became a hard stop for anything heavy. Tanks couldn't ford it. Recovery vehicles sank. Engineering units needed time, space, and stability. 3 things this sector didn't offer. And there were no alternatives. Every usable crossing point for miles was already mapped, ranged, and watched. This stretch of river was the last viable door. If it stayed closed, the southern axis froze in place. Fuel trucks backed up. Artillery stalled. Armor waited. Momentum bled out hour by hour. By late 2025, Russia didn't have the luxury of patience. The offensive timetable had already slipped. Losses in engineering units were catastrophic. Specialized bridge layers and recovery platforms had been chewed up across multiple fronts. What should have been routine logistics had turned into improvisation. That's how the decision was made. Instead of waiting for proper equipment that no longer existed, Russian planners repurposed what they still had. A T-80B VM main battle tank, designed to fight other tanks, was stripped down and converted into an emergency bridge layer. Half of a TMM steel bridge was welded onto its frame. Wooden planks were added to extend reach. A heavy cage was wrapped around the turret to confuse drone optics and deflect shrapnel. It was brutal engineering. Fast, crude, desperate. The logic was simple. Push the bridge across, anchor it just long enough, and flood the crossing with armor before Ukraine could react. Once vehicles were on the far bank, the problem would solve itself. Supply routes would reopen, units would fan out, the bottleneck would disappear. Everything depended on speed. That's why the blizzard mattered so much. Russian commanders believed the storm was a force multiplier. Snow-blinded optics, wind disrupted flight, low visibility shortened reaction times. Combined with electronic warfare, they expected Ukrainian drones to be ineffective at best, non-existent at worst. From inside the convoy, it felt like the perfect window. The weather, the jammers, the terrain. It all pointed to one conclusion. This was the moment to force it. What they didn't see was the other clock already running. For 4 days, Ukrainian units had tracked every movement in the sector. Thermal sensors didn't care about snow. They didn't care about wind. A running engine against frozen ground stood out instantly. Patterns emerged, idle times, route choices, the exact position where the bridge tank would have to slow, stop, and extend. On Ukrainian tactical screens, this wasn't a gamble. It was a schedule. They knew when the bridge would start deploying. They knew how long the hydraulics would take. They knew when the weight distribution would shift forward and when the support vehicles would be most exposed. Russia thought it was rushing a crossing. Ukraine was letting them walk into one. At 5 a.m., the convoy reached the approach road and slowed into a tight formation. The bridge tank took the lead, followed by recovery vehicles and armored carriers waiting for the moment the steel span touched the far bank. Snow hammered the hulls. Wind pushed sideways. Visibility was a tunnel of white. Inside the Russian command vehicle, the officer watched his thermal display and saw what he wanted to see. Nothing. No drones, no movement, just a blank storm. He gave the order to activate electronic warfare at full output. The jammer antennas came alive. Pole 21 began flooding the sky with noise. The R330 systems layered over it, turning the local spectrum into a screaming wall. In theory, any radio-controlled drone entering that bubble would lose its link, lose its video feed, and fall like a stone. Ukraine tested the shield exactly once. 4 FPV drones lifted off from a concealed position miles away, their pilots staring into shaky, grainy cameras as they pushed into the gale. These weren't the elite machines. They were simple, cheap scouts meant to answer one question. How strong is the jamming right now? The answer arrived instantly. One screen went gray, then another, then another. 3 feeds collapsed into static so violent it looked like the image was being torn apart. The drones drifted, spun, and dropped into the snow as useless lumps of plastic and lithium. From the Russian perspective, it was proof. The sky is ours. The commander's confidence rose with every second those drones failed. He radioed the convoy to keep pressure on the crossing. If Ukraine couldn't fly, Ukraine couldn't stop them. The blizzard was a gift, and the jammers were the lock on the door. To make sure the door stayed locked, Russia launched its own eyes. Fiber-optic reconnaissance drones, tethered by thin glass threads, slipped forward over the riverbank. Because their control signal traveled through a physical line, not the air, they were immune to the electronic storm. On Russian screens, the image snapped into sharp thermal clarity. The muddy banks, the partially deployed bridge, the exact alignment needed to reach the far side. The bridge tank began extending again. Metal groaned, hydraulics strained. The steel span crawled outward, inch by inch, while the convoy behind idled, and Ukraine let it happen. That was the second Russian mistake. Believing early success meant safety. The Ukrainian team watching from the cellar didn't panic when the first FPV died. They expected it. Those drones weren't an attack. They were a probe, a sacrifice, a signal to confirm the shape of the Russian electronic bubble. Now Ukraine knew exactly what Russia wanted most: a clean, confident deployment to 90% or more. So the Ukrainians didn't rush. They waited for the bridge to commit. They waited for the support vehicles to reveal themselves. They waited for the moment the crossing became irreversible. Then they opened the next phase, and the Russians wouldn't understand what was happening until the snow around them started burning. At 5:05 a.m., the snowstorm changed character. 6 new drones appeared on Russian sensors almost simultaneously. They were loud, bright, and impossible to miss. Their infrared emitters flared across thermal screens like fireworks, and their radio signatures were so strong it felt intentional, almost careless. They weren't attacking. They were inviting attention. The Russian trench teams reacted on instinct. Shotguns came up. A K-12S started barking into the whiteout. Red tracers ripped through the snow as soldiers tracked silhouettes that darted and zigzagged above the riverbank. To the Russians, it felt like a textbook drone defense, cheap targets falling, debris tumbling into the mud. What they didn't realize was that every trigger pull was a beacon. On Ukrainian thermal feeds, muzzle flashes bloomed like flares in the dark. Body heat spiked. Positions that had been vague became precise. The defenders were so focused on swatting noisy plastic out of the sky that they stopped watching the ground entirely. That's when the real attack arrived. Below the line of fire, hugging the frozen mud at less than 20 feet, a different sound cut through the storm. Faster, deeper, purposeful. Wild hornets. These weren't reconnaissance drones, and they weren't bait. They were built for speed and weight, designed to hit structural targets at full sprint. Their operators didn't need to see the defenders. They needed the vehicles. The first Hornet slipped under the shotgun fire and smashed into the fuel tank of a recovery vehicle parked near the bridge's anchor point. The explosion punched heat through the blizzard so violently it vaporized snow in midair. Metal panels tore loose. Flames rolled outward across the bank. Before the Russians could react, a second Hornet followed. Then a third. Support trucks burned. Anchors vanished. The equipment meant to stabilize the crossing became wreckage in seconds. Inside the bridge tank, alarms started screaming. The hydraulics shuddered. Load readings spiked. Without support vehicles holding position, the bridge layer was suddenly bearing forces it was never meant to handle alone. The Russian commander hesitated for exactly 1 moment. Then he doubled down. He ordered everything to keep firing. Shotguns, rifles, jammers at maximum output. The goal was simple: kill every drone before another one touched the bridge. More Ukrainian machines fell. 3 Wild Hornets were shredded midair, their remains vanishing into the storm. The Russian infantry cheered again. From their point of view, the defense was working. The turtle shell cage around the bridge tank deflected fragments. The steel structure still held. What they didn't see was that Ukraine wasn't trying to overwhelm them. Ukraine was isolating them. The support layer was gone. The recovery vehicles were burning. The bridge tank was now a single 60-ton mass pushing forward without backup, without redundancy, without a margin for error. The steel span crept outward again. 70%. 80%. Behind it, engines revved as the rest of the convoy prepared to move. Diesel exhaust thickened the air. The commander's confidence returned. He believed the worst was over. He was wrong, because Ukraine had never intended to stop the bridge early. They were waiting for the point where stopping it would no longer matter. And that point was getting closer with every inch of steel sliding forward into the snow. The bridge reached 90% deployment just after 5:10 a.m., and the night went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Gunfire slowed. The decoy drones were gone. The jammers were still screaming into the void, but there was nothing left to swat out of the sky. Snow kept falling. Wind kept howling. For a brief moment, it felt like the worst had passed. Inside the command vehicle, the Russian officer leaned forward, eyes locked on the feed from the fiber-optic drone. The image was clean, stable. The steel span hovered inches from the far bank, perfectly aligned. In his headset, drivers reported engines hot and ready. 15 armored vehicles were lined up behind the bridge tank, idling, waiting for the signal. 90% meant the hard part was done. 90% meant victory was seconds away. What the commander didn't understand was that 90% was the most dangerous number of the night. At that point, the bridge's center of gravity had shifted completely forward. The support anchors were gone. The weight of the steel was no longer distributed. It was concentrated. Every vibration, every hydraulic movement, every slight change in terrain now multiplied the stress inside the system. Ukraine knew this. They had calculated it days earlier. That's why nothing happened at 80%. That's why nothing happened at 90%. Ukraine wasn't waiting for a mistake. They were waiting for inevitability. At 5:12 a.m., the bridge crept forward again. 95%. The lead edge of the steel span hovered just above the muddy far bank. The gap was so small, it looked finished. In the Russian commander's mind, the crossing was already complete. He reached for the radio to give the order. He never got the chance. From a concealed position miles away, Ukraine released the final strike. 3 drones lifted off, silent, fast, and immune. These weren't radio-controlled. They didn't care about jammers. They didn't care about interference or noise. Each one was tethered to its pilot by a thin strand of glass, carrying data at full speed with zero lag. Fiber-optic FPVs. On Ukrainian screens, the image was crystal clear. 4K resolution. No static, no delay. The pilots didn't hunt for targets. They already knew where to go. The first drone came in low, faster than shotgun fire could track. It ignored the cage, ignored the bridge. It hit the primary hydraulic hinge, the single joint holding 60 tons of steel in balance. A white-hot flash tore through the mechanism. The second drone followed half a second later, slamming into the secondary support line. The glass tether snapped behind it as the charge detonated. The third drone never needed to impact. The structure failed instantly. The sound wasn't an explosion, it was deeper. A violent metallic crack, like a freight train tearing itself apart. The bridge folded forward under its own weight. 60 tons of steel lunged into the frozen river, dragging the T-80 chassis with it. The tank pitched nose down, tracks clawing uselessly at the bank before disappearing into the mud. For a split second, it stood nearly vertical, an absurd monument to desperation, then sank. 5 seconds. That's how long it took. 5 seconds from triumph to catastrophe. The armored convoy behind slammed on its brakes. Vehicles fishtailed in the sludge. Drivers shouted over the radio, but there was nowhere to go. The crossing was gone. The bridge was gone. The lead vehicle was now a twisted steel plug, blocking the only viable route forward. The Russian commander stared at his screen as it went dark. The offensive wasn't delayed. It was dead. The silence after the collapse was heavier than the gunfire that came before it. For several seconds, nobody moved. The snow kept falling. Engines idled. Radios crackled with confused voices trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Where the bridge had been, there was now only twisted steel and dark water swallowing the remains of a $5 million machine. Then Ukraine finished the job. Artillery coordinates that had been prepared days earlier were released. Tubes adjusted. Timers counted down. The first shells landed among the trapped vehicles less than a minute after the bridge disappeared. Explosions punched through the frozen ground, flipping armored carriers onto their sides and shredding exposed support trucks that had nowhere to maneuver. Cluster munitions followed. Sub-munitions scattered across the kill zone, tearing into anything that hadn't already been immobilized. Crews abandoned vehicles. Some ran, some hid. None escaped the reality that the only exit route was now a sunken mass of steel blocking the river like a cork. By the time the blizzard began to thin, more than 24 pieces of Russian heavy equipment had been destroyed or abandoned in that single sector. The convoy never crossed. The offensive never resumed. The numbers told a brutal story. Ukraine had spent roughly $8,000 on modified drones. Russia lost more than $7 million in armor, engineering equipment, and vehicles, along with weeks of momentum that could not be replaced. But the real damage wasn't financial. That crossing was the logistical artery feeding the southern Pokrovsk axis. With it gone, Russian units on the far side were stranded. Fuel deliveries stopped. Ammunition slowed. Artillery fell silent. Every resupply mission now required longer routes under Ukrainian surveillance, stretching already thin resources even further. To prevent another disaster, Moscow would be forced to pull electronic warfare systems away from active front lines just to guard rear logistics. Protecting supply lines meant weakening assaults. Every solution created a new problem. Footage of the collapse spread fast. A 60-ton bridge tank snapping under its own weight. A breakthrough turning into a riverbed monument. The illusion of improvisation shattered in real time. This wasn't a story about drones winning a firefight. It was a story about patience beating desperation, about math beating metal, about a modern offensive undone by a single hinge, a single moment, and a wire that never lost its signal. When a war reaches the point where scrap metal is welded onto top-tier tanks just to cross a ditch, the outcome is already decided. Ukraine didn't just destroy a bridge, they ended an offensive before it began.